The Hollow Hour. Every night at exactly midnight, the small town of Ravenswood fell silent. It wasn't the kind of quiet you find in the dead of night when everyone's asleep. It was a deeper, heavier stillness, like the entire world was holding its breath. The wind would stop, the crickets would go quiet, and even the distant hum of electricity seemed to fade away. For 1 hour, everything would be still. And then, just as suddenly, the town would come back to life as if nothing had happened. The townspeople had learned to live with it. They didn't like to talk about it, and most just made sure they were in bed long before midnight. Over the years, there had been plenty of stories about ghosts, old curses, and dark rituals, but no one really knew why it happened, and most were too scared to find out. David wasn't from Ravenswood. He had moved there a few months ago, looking for a quiet place to escape the chaos of the city and focus on his writing. The town's strange stillness didn't bother him. If anything, he found it peaceful. But when he heard about the Hollow Hour, he was intrigued. David was an insomniac, often staying up late into the night, and the thought of a town that fell completely silent for an hour every night was too interesting to ignore. One night, David decided he'd stay up and see for himself. He made a pot of coffee, settled into his chair by the window, and waited. As the clock struck midnight, he felt it immediately. The shift, the way everything seemed to pause. It was like someone had flipped a switch and turned off all the sound. The wind outside his window stopped, the leaves on the trees went still, and there wasn't even the faintest murmur of activity. He glanced at the clock. 12:01. The town was completely, utterly silent. At first, nothing happened. David sat there, watching, expecting something dramatic, but there was just stillness. He could see the street outside, dimly lit by a couple of street lamps, but everything was frozen, like a photograph. After a few minutes, he began to wonder if maybe everyone had been exaggerating. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something move. It was subtle, just a flicker of shadow across the street. He turned to look, but there was nothing there. He scanned the street, his eyes straining in the dark. And that's when he noticed it, a shape, barely visible, standing at the edge of the light. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a person, just standing there, perfectly still. David's heart began to race. He wanted to look away, to convince himself he was just imagining things, but he couldn't. The figure was almost blending into the darkness, its outline faint and indistinct, like it was made of smoke. For a moment, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but then it moved, stepping out of the shadows and into the faint glow of the street lamp. David's breath caught in his throat. The figure was tall, with a face that was just wrong. It wasn't that there was anything missing. It was more like everything was just a little off, like someone had tried to draw a human face from memory but hadn't quite gotten it right. The eyes were too wide, the mouth too narrow, and the skin was pale, almost colorless. It just stood there, staring up at David's window, not moving, not blinking. He felt a chill run down his spine, but he couldn't look away. Then, slowly, the figure raised a hand and pointed, straight at him. David's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in the silence. He wanted to move, to duck out of sight, but his body wouldn't cooperate. He was frozen, just like the rest of the town. The figure didn't move, didn't lower its hand, just kept pointing, as if it was waiting for something. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the stillness broke. The wind began to blow, the leaves rustled, and a distant car engine rumbled down the street. David blinked, and the figure was gone. He jumped up, ran to the window, and scanned the street, but there was nothing. Just the empty, quiet street, lit by the soft glow of the street lamps. He tried to tell himself he'd imagined it, that his mind was playing tricks on him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen something real, something he wasn't supposed to see. He thought about telling someone, but who would believe him? Besides, he wasn't sure he wanted to know what the people in this town would say if he started asking questions about the Hollow Hour. Over the next few nights, David tried to ignore it, tried to go back to his writing and pretend everything was normal. But every night, as midnight approached, he found himself sitting by the window, waiting. And every night, the town would fall silent, and the figure would appear, always in the same spot, always pointing at him. David didn't know what it wanted, but he knew it was trying to tell him something. He started to notice other things, two shadows that moved when there shouldn't have been any, whispers that he couldn't quite make out, and flashes of light in the distance that disappeared as soon as he looked at them. The more he watched, the more he realized he wasn't the only one. There were people in other houses, looking out their windows, just like him, and the figure was pointing at them, too. One night, he couldn't take it anymore. As the clock ticked toward midnight, he grabbed a flashlight and headed out into the street. The town was already starting to fall silent, but he didn't care. He needed to know, As he approached a spot where the figure always stood, he felt the air grow colder, thicker, like he was wading through water. He could see his breath in the air, even though it was a warm summer night.
The figure was there, waiting for him. It didn't move, didn't react as he approached. David stopped a few feet away, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice barely audible in the silence. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it slowly turned, raising its arm to point down the street, toward the edge of town. David followed its gaze, and for a moment, he thought he saw something at doorway, glowing faintly in the distance, just for a second. And then it was gone, and the figure was gone, and the town was waking up again as if nothing had happened. David stood there, shivering, staring at the empty street. He knew now that the hollow owl wasn't just some strange phenomenon, and it wasn't just in his head. It was real, and it was trying to show him something. The next night, he would follow it, and he would find out what lay at the end of that silent, haunted hour, even if it was the last thing he ever did.